The most important thing to emphasize is that the ecological future that we're entering must be a future where we increase and enhance and produce new forms of pleasure. If it's going to be about efficiency or sustainability, then we're still going to be talking in a kind of oil language domain of petroculture. And that would be a shame. Like if we gave up using fossil fuels, but we retained the fossil fuel mentality, which is basically to do with the fact that oil is a toxic, precious resource. You have to be very careful with it, you know. And what a shame. You know, and as Goebbels said, you know, when I hear the word culture, I reach for my gun. When I hear the word sustainability, I reach for my sunscreen. I don't understand why we have to sustain something that is clearly violent. I don't see why. And the whole notion of sustaining suggests the idea that things can keep going on and on and on. And I profoundly reject the idea that going on and on and on is what existing means. And in fact, this brings us to another dangerous concept, which is the notion of survival. In the name of this concept, so many life forms, including obviously human beings, get destroyed, deported, burned, executed, tortured. I mean, it's a bad, bad, bad concept, and somehow ecological reality can't just be about surviving. It has to be about another kind of life that isn't completely opposed to death, right? Now, the point about art is that it's very much an evocation of the fragility of things. When I experience art, I'm in a kind of almost telepathic-like mind meld with another being that probably isn't human, probably isn't sentient. Maybe it's a painting, you know, maybe it isn't even alive in the technical sense. In some way, this relationship is very fragile because if one of us were to get too excited, the other one would be killed. I mean, I went to see My Bloody Valentine 2 years ago, and there's a point in the gig where they play the most incredible oral assault you ever heard for 17 minutes, louder than everything they were already playing. Everyone's wearing earplugs. People were throwing up, fainting, running out of the room, but you wanted to be there because it was beautiful, right? And this kind of pleasure-pain threshold is very, very ambiguous, yeah? And you begin to realize that if you actually literally turned up the music, it would kill you. If it went to a certain decibel level, it would actually take your body apart. And that's a good way of thinking about art. If the art was somehow turned up to 11, it could envelop you, it could destroy you, or you could eat it. I mean, you could take a spoonful of it and, you know, so either way, you know, then that relationship disappears, right? So the art experience for me is a little tiny light on your cockpit kind of dashboard that says, warning, death imminent, death is possible, right? It's like a fragility light. And I feel like we need very much to include this little tiny dot of death experience in the concept of life, and also in the concept of how we do art. That doesn't mean that we should go around destroying things. It's the opposite, because to me, life is intrinsically fragile, you know, because beings are intrinsically ambiguous, and therefore what's beautiful about this exhibition and what's beautiful about the festival is that it was not in the key of oil, it was not in the key of survival, it was not in the key of things going on and on forever, it was in the key of many different kinds of pleasure coexisting. Sometimes the pleasure expanding one's capacity to feel pleasure to the point where it could become ambiguous, right? So that the threshold between pleasure and pain you start to see, or, you know, pain could be not just physical pain, but some kind of feeling of exposure or being confronted or being embarrassed or something like that, right? And how somehow the art is almost training us to not just tolerate, but appreciate more and more layers of ambiguity, and I think that's a very powerful ethical act, especially because art is a non-human being. A work of art is a non-human being. And so if you can do this with a work of art, you can also do this with a spider. Pretty much every artwork in the show addressed some notion of quirky. To me, there was no one particular work that stood out, but perhaps I'm going to use a couple to talk about. I might use Spaler's work with the shadow on the crest, and I might also use the Becoming Plant Witch Machine gynecological art, because to me those works were very much about having more than a conversation with non-human beings in ways that opened up interesting pathways of pleasure that were also ambiguous. You know, if you're going to stand there letting your shadow be cast for hours and hours and hours and impress upon the crest as it grows the form of your body, in a way what you're doing is you're becoming the Empire State Building in Andy Warhol's Empire State movie, right? And the crest is the celluloid, and you are in fact making a film, is what you are in fact doing. And in the same way, the folds and surfaces of the body in the gynecological art also become kind of celluloid for some kind of film-like motion. It's the fact that things are always moving that interests me, not because they're being pushed, but because they're intrinsically flickering without being pushed. And we know this now from quantum theoretical experiments, but it's also true in general, which is why the quantum theoretical experiments can happen. And I think this quivering is exactly the kind of quirkiness, you could describe it as that, because what it is in fact is the way an object, and when I say object I mean any entity at all, Tim, black hole, pen, cup of coffee, quasar, spider, right? Any entity is a deviation from itself constantly. The way it appears is always deviating from what it is, and the way, and appears here also means how it can be accessed. It's always a little bit deviating from what it is. Nevertheless, the appearance of the spider is a spider appearance. It's not an octopus. It's a spider, you know? And so there's this beautiful paradox in reality that, in fact, that kind of quirky, deviant ambiguity is in fact a signal of some kind of ontological accuracy, yeah? And I feel like the kind of diversity in the biggest sense of that word of the show was very beautifully interfaced with the intrinsic biodiversity of the biosphere, which is the important thing to remember about it. The one concept that so far has made it into international speech through Agenda 21 of the 1990 Earth Summit in Rio, this notion of biodiversity. And so quirky to me has that quality of deviantly queer and curious and slightly funny and slightly weird, and all these are very beautiful ecological chemicals, it seems to me. Usually when we talk about nature, when we talk about green, what we're really talking about is an anthropocentrically scaled version of this quivering, uneasy, ambiguous, quirky, queer, deviant biosphere. In other words, we're not really talking about it at all. What we're really doing is we're reifying it into something that suits our needs. The problem and paradox of a lot of ecological politics and planning and thinking is that it really is to do with allowing human beings to carry on more or less the same, which is actually, of course, ecological destruction. That's what human beings carrying on the same is. And at this point, humans are so powerful that what this indeed means is mass extinction. Now, there have only been 5 mass extinctions on this planet so far. When I say mass extinction, what I mean is many life forms being wiped. The last one that happened was the Cretaceous boundary with the asteroid that hit the Earth and destroyed the dinosaurs, I think 25% of life forms survived it. The previous one, which is they call the end Permian extinction, was a global warming extinction event, and it wiped out everything except for 4% of life forms. So human beings are now the asteroid. I'm sitting here doing this, but in fact, I'm a little tiny part of an asteroid hurtling through space, about to crash into Earth, or actually crashing into Earth in slow motion. The trouble with extinction is you can't see it. It's a hyperobject. You can't actually point to species disappearing. It's a real scientific problem. So it's got this uncanny, spooky quality of one day we're going to wake up and find that either of two things will be true, or both. There will be so many less life forms, or we won't exist, or both. This whole myth of the world without us, that we can somehow project into an imaginary future and look back with a kind of schadenfreude on our own stupid mistakes, is a kind of imaginary continuation of the stupid mistake, which is that we can somehow stand outside of stuff and watch it. And if there really was a world without humans at this point, humans are so chemically entangled with the biosphere that that would mean either everything else went extinct almost, or we went extinct, or both. It's not cool. Or we're about to go extinct, right? Not we went extinct, but we're about to go extinct. So approaching non-human beings doesn't mean deleting humans somehow. It means including humans as a life form among other life forms. And that means going way, way beyond green, for sure. Even if we're completely fucked, I'm still going to party like it's 1999. There's no ethical goodness in just rolling over, going into the fetal position and playing dead. Because why? Because, like I was just saying, we are a life form among other life forms, and if we roll over and play dead, it means everything goes extinct at this point. So whether or not everything goes wrong, something needs to happen. It's rather like in the Samuel Beckett story where he says, I can't go on, I must go on, I'll go on. But I think with a little bit more juice in it than maybe Beckett liked to say, the way he liked to say it. Art for me is thought from the future that hasn't yet been thought yet. Art is always radically open to future-ness, or sort of futurality, a kind of radically unpredictable future that provides the logical basis for predictable futures. And so art, in that sense, isn't just a representation of the future. It is, in fact, a kind of software or activation device or magic, because it is, in fact, directly tampering with cause and effect. If we are to believe the last 200 years of Western philosophy, this is actually a perfectly normal thing to say, that causality is not a kind of machine-like process churning away underneath appearances. Causality is in the appearance realm, and what do we normally call this appearance realm? We call it the aesthetic dimension. And it's very, very obvious that when you do art, you are messing with cause and effect. You take some yellow paint, you take it out of the pot, you take a brush, you put it over there. Those are actions. You go and look at it. That's an action, that's cause and effect. That's not just looking at a representation. So art isn't simply a utopian picture. It is a kind of futurality activation device. So we need to be a little careful what kind of futurality devices we're making, because they really work. And this exhibition and festival really, really worked.